All right, so welcome back. What I'd like to do today is build on all of that virus and immune system cell stuff that we did last time. So the stuff we start today I would consider to be testable. The stuff on the virus and the cell types are important to us to understand evolution within that system, but I won't test you directly on T cells, macrophages, B cells, or HIV. All right, this material is evolution material. All right, so one of the keys to evolutionary biology is what's called selection thinking. The idea is that evolution by natural selection is an automatic process that happens whenever a population shows the prerequisite heritable variation in survivorship and reproductive success. So I want to go back through the tenets of Darwinian natural selection and fitness, but we're going to change the way we think about it a little bit, because prior to today we talked about these things within the context of ecology. Now we're going to consider it within the context of evolution. And there are subtle differences in the way these terms work based on the perspective of ecologists and evolutionary biologists. So let's start off with that first tenet here. More individuals are produced than could possibly survive. So I have a couple of examples here, very Darwinian. Let's take some salmon, right? The salmon swim upstream, and then they release eggs and sperm. Fertilization occurs in the water column to produce the zygotes. For every 8,000 eggs that a salmon produces, about 4,500 alevin survive. Now, alevin are these individual larval fish with the yolk sac attached. All right? Of these 4,500 alevin, we're going to get 650 fry. Fry are the larval fish without the yolk sacs. All right, the 650 fry, of those 200 par survive. Par are the juveniles that still live in fresh water, and from these 250 smolt, these are the juveniles that live in salt water, and of those, only 2 spawning adults return in a few years to that same stream to reproduce. 8,000 possible offspring, if all of these were fertilized, to 2 individuals that survive to reproduce. That fits under this more individuals produced than could possibly survive. Here we have acorns. The age of the acorn and the number of acorns that are produced, somewhere around 25 years old, the tree begins to produce offspring. And as the tree ages, the number of offspring in the form of acorns it produces increases dramatically, until we're out here about 120 years old. It's producing about 2,200 offspring every year. The area under this curve would represent all of the offspring produced over the lifetime of this 150-year-old tree. We are not swimming in salmon and oak trees, which suggests that a lot more individuals for some species are produced than could possibly survive. Okay? The offspring that are produced differ from each other, right? There are differences in all sorts of traits. I've grabbed some happy face spiders. These are one of my favorite ones because they have a little happy face on them. They're plain zebras, this Laguus, facetus shells, the garden bean, that damselfly up there, just to show you that there's incredible amounts of variation among individuals within a species. I also have here the shortest man in the world and the tallest man in the world together in one picture. And then here, I like to do this one because it reminds me of how old I am. This individual here shows you some natural variation. If you recognize him, possibly, he's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, basketball player of all time. He makes Kobe Bryant and who's that guy from Cleveland, and then he went out to LA. LeBron James makes those guys look like kindergartners. This, of course, is Wilt Chamberlain, and this is Willie Shoemaker, the winningest jockey of all time. He's a billionaire. in case you didn't know. But again, lots of variation. The variation among individuals, we expect some of this variation to be heritable. That is, offspring tend to look like their parents. Here, if we could pick out the offspring from the parents, we would see that offspring tend to look like the parents. Here are the offspring of these warthogs, and there are the parents, and we would expect them to look like each other, have similar biochemistries to the parents, and similar behavioral traits. Right, here are the Sutherlands, father and son, and this family, the Sheen family, I think that's Emilio Estevez. I think he's a half-sibling, but the idea is to show you that individuals tend to look like their parents. Okay? All right. Those three tenets put together give us that final statement of the favored forms preserved, or offspring with the favored traits are the ones that are going to survive to reproduce. So according to Darwin, the way this would work is you'd have some ancestral organism. I've made a shape here, but the idea is this is some ancestral organism, and they're a group of individuals that look very similar to this one living in a population. If I took some of these individuals and selected for them, perhaps the ovals do better in this population than the other ones, that over time the ovals would leave more offspring, and I would end up with a population that looked like ovals. On the other hand, that same population with its prerequisite variation, I could select for individuals that look like circles, and I would end up with a population that looked like circles, or I could select for individuals that look like squares, and over time I would get a group of individuals that looked like squares. Now, Darwin says this happens naturally. Once the population shows this prerequisite variation, and some individuals are better suited than others, I would get changes in the way organisms looked over evolutionary time. He felt that artificial selection demonstrated this as well. Here's an ancestral pigeon. You take that ancestral pigeon population and humans in different places, starting with that same ancestral pigeon population, could produce all sorts of bizarre types of pigeons for God knows what reason. I still don't know why anybody would want to do that to a pigeon, but in any event, we end up with a bunch of very different looking pigeons because of a different trait being selected for in each of these populations. Humans did this with animals during domestication. Humans have also done this to plants during domestication. This is the ancestral wild mustard. This group here is all the same species. Okay? The species name here is Brassica oleracea. All of these are members of the same species, just as all of those are all members of the same species. So here, by selecting for different traits, I could select for a large stem, that gets me to kohlrabi. I could select for a large root, that gets me to a turnip. I could select for large leaves, that's kale or mustard green. I could select for a large inflorescence, a large grouping of flowers, that's broccoli. I could select for a single terminal bud that inflorescence will derive from, that's cabbage or cauliflower. I could select for large apical buds, large axillary buds. That would be the world's worst vegetable, that's Brussels sprouts. Okay? All right. Now let's take a look at fitness. So, fitness is a central concept in evolutionary theory, but like a lot of terms we use in biology, we're okay with what these terms mean until we're asked to define them. As soon as someone asks us to define these terms, it gets very difficult to describe exactly what we're talking about. We'll see a number of these as we move on, including the term species, very difficult to define. So what I've got here are several different approaches to how you would define a species here in biology. So let's take the first one. This one's from Wikipedia. Wikipedia, I wouldn't recommend using for a lot of things. but for evolutionary biology material, it's actually pretty good. The evolutionary biologists will police the evolutionary biology sites because the creationists like to come on and change the words. So they're actually pretty good. So let's start with this first one. Fitness is a central concept in evolutionary theory. It describes the capability of an individual of certain genotype to reproduce, usually equal to the proportion of the individual's genes in all the genes of the next generation. So let's take that apart a little bit. It describes the capability of an individual genotype to reproduce. So, like I described before, we often think of fitness and natural selection in terms of mortality, but it's not. It's a differential reproduction. When we think about natural selection, we're thinking about how successful individuals are at producing copies of their alleles into the next generation. How able are they to reproduce? Well, if we're describing the capability of an individual of a certain genotype to reproduce, there's my genotype. I'm describing the ability of this organism to reproduce. That's its fitness. And then it says, usually equal to the proportion of the individual's genes in all of the genes of the next generation. So, here are its alleles. One way I could determine the fitness of this individual is to look in the next generation and see how common these two alleles are in the next generation. The frequency of these alleles describes the fitness of this individual. Okay? All right, the second definition is from an evolutionary biology textbook. Right. The extent to which an individual contributes genets to future generations, or an individual's score on a measure of performance expected to correlate with genetic contribution to future generations, such as lifetime reproductive success. Now, we've moved away from Wikipedia to the textbook, so the definitions are getting a little bit more complex, more syllables in the words, but let's take it apart. The extent to which an individual contributes genets to future generations. Genet is all of the individuals that share the same genotype. Most of the time when we talk about genets, we're talking about individuals that can produce offspring through some type of clonal or asexual reproduction. So here's my plant, it sends out a structure, pops up a new individual. Both of these individuals share the same genotype, therefore they're members of the same genet. Over time, this connection may decay, and now I have two separate physiological individuals, but they're still the same genetic individual. They have exactly the same genotype. So, the extent to which an individual contributes genets to future generations, that's copies of its own genes, or in this case, copies of its genotype. Okay? Or a measure of performance. The most common way to do this would be to just go out and say, okay, what's a measure of your performance expected to correlate with your lifetime reproductive success? Well, the number of offspring that you produce is likely to correlate with that. Okay? All right, number 3, also from an evolutionary biology textbook. The success of an entity in reproducing, hence the average contribution of an allele or genotype to the next generation or to succeeding generations. Right, the success of an entity in reproducing. Well, we've seen that one before. That's the number of offspring. More offspring equals more fitness. All right? Or the average contribution of an allele or genotype to the next generation. The number of offspring I produce is an indication of how fit I am, but at the same point, I'm contributing alleles to the next generation. the frequency of this allele in the next generation is also a measure of my fitness. This is a little bit different because not all of my offspring are going to have this recessive allele. Some may have picked up the dominant allele. So a little bit different in the way we're thinking about it, or a genotype to the next generation or to succeeding generations. Now, notice here that when we talk about genotype or allele, that we're not necessarily talking about individuals anymore, right? This individual here, as goofy as it looks, this individual, I can quantify its fitness looking at its offspring. The second part of the definition is saying that the genotype itself has a fitness, and if we look at the number of copies of this genotype in the next generation, that's also a measure of fitness. Or I could look at a single allele and ask how common that allele is in the next generation. Under this definition, if we're thinking about genotypes and alleles, we're thinking about molecules, and the idea that molecules can have a fitness. Individuals have fitness by producing offspring. Molecules have fitness by producing copies of these molecules. Now keep in mind, if we're talking about a virus with an RNA molecule here that represents its genome, the RNA molecule has a particular genotype, right? And if I quantify the number of copies of this RNA molecule in the next generation, albeit I have to go through a lot of steps to get there, but if I quantify the number of copies of this original RNA genotype, I'm getting at the fitness of this RNA molecule, which is also the fitness of the virus that contains that RNA molecule. Okay? A little bit different. The last one is from an ecology textbook. This is Rick Liff's, he did an ecology textbook called The Economy of Nature. The genetic contribution of an individual's descendants to future generations. The previous definitions that we've worked with, this individual has offspring. That measures the individual.